Thank you so much for coming. We have a really great presentation today on the topic of localization. As you probably read the description, we will talk about the issues of internationalization, globalization, and localization. What are the differences? And we're going to look at a case study of a recent project that was done very successfully in Japan. And we have John Ashley, who is going to be presenting. He's the manager of user experience at Refinery, and he was previously manager of experience design at Destiny Web Solutions. He has a very extensive experience in interactive design and multimedia, so website architecture, and he went to Japan to conduct some interviews. And he'll be talking more about that case study, basically. But please welcome John Ashley.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Just a note that I was intending to co-present this with my content strategist who speaks and reads Japanese. So we will get to some slides where I will have to bluff my way through them, and you'll bear with me in that regard. Since there'll be things there that I really, truly can't speak to. And he may arrive late rather than not ending up at all. In fact, that might be him right there. No, it's not. Okay. So, localization. It's big in Japan. Hopefully everybody got that joke, that reference. So it's a long agenda. Easily we could talk about localization, internationalization for hours and hours. But what I thought we'd do is just give a little bit of background for folks that have not really delved into internationalization, localization. Talk about some of the issues in terms of user-centered design and how it pertains to what we worked on. Give a specific case study as an example of what we did, what we worked on. And then talk about some other aspects, relating to how you go about this kind of a project. I was interested first at a number of people here who have already worked on a localization project. Just by show of hands, can people show me how many people have worked on localization? What types of languages were you looking at? Where were you going?
So in Europe, I think we're 7 different languages.
So
we're 22 different sites.
Like that. What about you, sir?
Scandinavian, so we were supporting Swedish, Norwegian, and Finland.
What about you, Jason?
Just the Latin-based languages, French, Spanish.
And
French.
In French? Okay. There are some commonalities between certain languages and things you need to know about them. There are others, for instance, when you go into the double byte character, Eastern language, etc., that there are certain things that do get somewhat more complex. And we'll talk loosely about those. But if you've done a localization project, you probably know as much or more than me. So let me be clear, and I wanted to set this up right away, that this is the first localization project that I worked on. And though we're going to talk about the research that I did in delving into it, because I had to bootstrap myself, I can't say that I'm a localization expert with one project under my belt. But it's a great case study, and I think you'll enjoy it. So why localization? Even translation itself is difficult. There are a couple of interesting anecdotes here about how KFC, when they went to China, translated their tagline of finger licking good is "eat your fingers off," which is great. There's of course the old classic everybody knows about of the Nova and how it means no go, and they couldn't understand why it wasn't selling in Spanish-speaking countries or Latin American countries. So there's certainly been a good history of people doing it poorly, right? Even just mere translation. Some of the more interesting ones around here that speak more to localization rather than just translation, when Procter & Gamble went into Japan, they were still advertising it as all temperature cheer. Only nearly 100% of everyone always washes in cold water there. So if you don't look at what is norm in the culture, you're going to waste a lot of time and energy, and you're not going to be able to speak to the audience that you intend to speak to. All temperature, who cares? And an American firm that apparently went to India and used a symbol of an owl, which symbolized bad luck there. So continuing with this, why localize rather than just translate it? Well, surely we can, we know this text says that, and we know, multiple languages. We can get somebody that speaks both. Why don't you just translate it? Well, simple translation is not enough. If you think about just Spanish alone, which in terms of the North America, Latin America, that's actually a pretty easy language to think about translating to. But whose Spanish would you use? Would it be Mexican Spanish? Would it be Central America? Would it be the Spanish spoken in Spain? Even a single language has many differences based on locale. We'll talk a little bit more about locale and the difference there. Well, next. Localization is tied to locale, and this is a combination, a concept of not only the language, but the geography, that is where it is, and then the culture that surrounds where it is. So you can have within a particular region multiple cultures. So it has to be a combination of those that you would localize to, not just a particular translation. And we'll get more into that. The other thing I wanted to point out, because many of the people I speak to have really only done English-based websites primarily for audiences within the U.S., is just the size of the population. Who's online. And in 2004, the breakdown was that only about 35% of the overall people that were online spoke English as their primary language. 35%. That means that more people don't speak English who are online than those that do speak English. So that's a really good call right there about why you would need to have this skill. And this chart is really just demonstrating the growth from 96 all the way through to, I believe it was projected 2005, this is done 2004, the breakdown of languages and how it's just grown exponentially as the web has exploded, the number of different languages that you'll see online. I'm sorry, the individuals who are going online and what they speak. So there's a mnemonic in this industry of guilt. One of the things I'll just reference right now, I did distribute a reference sheet that has a whole bunch of very interesting sites and URLs around here. And if you didn't get one because I didn't put them on every seat, I've got a ton more printed out. One of the resources that I drew upon back in the fall was LISA, a Localization Industry Standards Association. And they describe the overall picture within localization as the combination of globalization, internationalization, localization, and translation. And while sometimes people use these words interchangeably, they are not. They have distinct meanings. We'll talk, the relationship between them is interesting. So globalization is not just having a worldwide presence, but it's also about incorporating a global perspective into the aspects of either a company or your communications or a system. Internationalization tends to speak specifically to making a particular body of content or a system culture neutral, that is ready to be able to be localized or translated. And this means things like when you put together the content, you should avoid idioms, you should avoid metaphor. In a technical sense, it means taking a look at, are you ready to have databases and systems that can handle multi-byte character encoding in Unicode? Whether or not your system can handle multiple currencies. If you're going to try and offer a system that collects that type of information, not just having your system be set up to handle US dollars, that kind of thing. So localization specifically is the process of adapting or designing the system so that it looks and feels like it was locally produced. That is, that someone who's consuming that communication doesn't look and go, oh, I can tell an American did this, or I can tell that this came from Europe, etc. It should feel like it was produced, inside the locale that you're designing for. So it really requires an understanding of the local users and the culture there, and it involves both content, linguistic, and technical issues that all must be covered in order to appropriately localize. So then finally, it involves translation. While this is the first thing that people think of, and it does represent the bulk of the work in terms of hours of, if you need to move content. Really, translation is just one component, simply, translating one text into the language of another. So, LISA, that localization body that I mentioned that I used for part of my research, had a visualization of the overall relationship between those concepts that I thought kind of captured it well. The overall picture is globalization, and that you internationalize to get your neutral, culture-neutral content or system, and that every time you localize is another element, and a part of localization is translation. So overall, that's kind of the equation of what the guilt model is about. So in delving into all the various issues back in the fall, I ran across this example that I thought would be interesting to illustrate to folks in the design community about some of the aspects that you need to pay attention to when you're going to have a system that needs to be handled in multiple languages, or you're putting together a design that's going to actually be realized in a different language. So within this example, we see that there's a particular element design or page design in English, and as it moves through the different languages, you'll note that there's different line length, there's different character heights, there's different layouts and justification, there's text that reads from left to right, there's text that reads from right to left. So this is the kind of thing that if you have, say, designers working in English, but in the end it's going to be realized in Japanese, it's something you have to take into account. So for instance, there are metrics around the length of a line that you can expect that if the entire site is going to be in Japanese, you'll tend to be shorter in terms of sentences because each ideogram or each character is a word, but it'll be taller, right? So you need to take that into account when you're doing page layout and whatnot. So I thought it might be of interest to some folks just to know who some of the leading translation houses are out there. Unless you have an in-house translation team for whatever the languages you're going to, you're probably going to be best off working with a translation vendor. And the one that we chose is one that we had some workings with in the past, and that's translations.com. And there were a couple of specific reasons why we worked with them, and I'll talk a little about those later. The other interesting anecdote that I wanted to mention is one of the largest firms for localization is Lionbridge. I believe they're out of England, but they take their name from the abbreviation for localization. A brief anecdote, just in case people don't know, and I skipped it on the last one. The code that people use for I-18N and L-10N harkens back to old time when system administrators would abbreviate names when they were too long to be handled by a system. So they just put the first letter, the last letter, and then the character count in the middle. And at some point that translated over to this industry because people got tired of writing internationalization and localization. So it became Lion and I-18N, and you'll see that a lot. And Lionbridge just built off of that. So I also wanted to talk about how it's beyond translation, it's beyond language in the way that we communicate in a design. Now, just looking at this, all of you probably have already had the brand pop into your head without even hearing any audio.
どうも、マックです。こんにちは、パソコンです。最近ホームページ作ったんだ。
But hearing even just a little bit of audio now, we recognize that we don't, unless somebody speaks Japanese here, and since my comment is not here, I don't think anyone does. We know what brand this is. We know what this is about. We get the general message here. There's a cool guy and a geek. Okay? We get that whole message, and not a bit of it is being communicated via language. Okay? If you even watch that in detail, and that's just off of the apple.co.jp, you'll actually get the intent. If you've ever seen an Apple ad, you can watch that without any language at all and go, he's going through the steps it takes to set up your computer, and a Mac only takes 2 steps. And he gets mad and says, where's the 3rd step? Where's the 3rd step? And he goes, well, okay, I can do something or other. So you get that whole entire exchange without the benefit of language. So the point there is that brand, sound, body language, style, etc., all communicate even without language. And so part of localization is choosing the right one. There's a reason why they chose to dress their PC guy up differently here than they did in the States, or the ads that we're used to. So another little anecdote that I wanted to share that also speaks to that it's beyond language is something that occurred to me when I was in the hotel in Tokyo. I had read in prepping for going over about a news story in one of the newspapers that I had subscribed to from Japan, just to kind of put my head into kind of a Japanese mindset, about how 7-Elevens had just started carrying canned oxygen. And I thought, okay, I get there, I'm going to get myself some canned oxygen. I got to try this, right? It turns out it's actually pretty good for coping with jet lag, and with the 13-hour plane trip and the 13-hour time difference, you're kind of whacked unless you've done it a lot like Jim back there. So I went to the 7-Eleven homepage, and they geodetected that I was coming from a Japan IP, so I automatically got sent to here. Okay? And in looking at this, I looked at the page and I went, oh, that's the store locator. That is, it had all the affordance and the presence that I would expect a store locator to have. So without being able to read Japanese, I said, okay, here's my store locator. And I got this page. So I looked at this and I said, well, I don't know what any of these are, but this is the proper format for a mailing postal code. And I'm staying at a hotel, which I have their information on, so I've got the postal code. I must put in the postal code right here. That's what that's for. So the affordance of the interface told me that without me being able to read the language. And it turns out that this is the results that I got. I'm staying at the Imperial Hotel right here in Tokyo. That's me. And then these are all the area 7-Elevens that, in fact, I can find that they have an ATM machine there. And I can figure out, oh, these two are in walking distance, so I can get there. And I was able to navigate the interface without being able to speak the language at all. So key kind of message to take away there is that sometimes a well-designed interface doesn't even need language to communicate what you're supposed to do. And I felt that this was a great example of, making it easy for me, a non-Japanese speaker, to find a local 7-Eleven. By the way, the oxygen was fun. Okay. So localization is a field unto itself, but many of us work in the world of user-centered design, right? UCD. So what are the aspects of user-centered design in terms of localization? What are some of the issues that come up? So it turns out that there's a good body of research on doing cultural research. That is, there have been many people who have been there and done that, and you can leverage their work in bootstrapping yourself and in preparing for that type of research. There are a couple of key books, which I will have to admit, in the 2-3 weeks we had to prep for it, I did not read. I instead read all of the mediated, here are the abbreviated versions and reports and whatnot that cited these two books, but they are the ones that are cited the most often. Beyond Borders, Web Globalization Strategies, and the Geert Hofstede book, and Hofstede is actually cited by numerous folks. Where I got my Hofstede is through Aaron Marcus, which many people will recognize from information architecture way back. He cited a number of the things that we'll talk about here from Hofstede in Cultures and Organizations. If you have your ACM Digital Library registration, go in there, and they've got a whole lot of papers and articles around localization and cultural differences and interface elements, and those were great reads. And again, I mentioned Aaron Marcus. He's got a number of articles that are in the reference sheet that were just absolutely helpful in getting my mind around what are some of the issues. So the other aspect is you're not just researching, in my case, how to do localization and what are some of the issues in that interface development for another culture, but researching the culture itself, right? So I didn't know much about the Japanese culture. What I did know would probably have been stereotypes, right? Stereotypical stuff that I did not want to rely on or assume. And the great thing is with the internet and with libraries and whatnot, I was able to find books and papers and periodicals and various online resources where I could kind of understand a little bit better about the culture. Now, there's one thing to be aware of. Cultures change. They certainly change faster than we publish books. So when I get my mid-'80s How to Do Business with the Japanese book, and they say, but stay away from black suits. You don't want to wear a black suit. They're reserved solely for funerals. Well, it turns out that might have been still true up until the mid-'80s, but it's no longer true. There were plenty of people walking around in black suits in the business districts and whatnot. It simply was outdated information. So that'll happen too. So what did Hofstede talk about? And I got this through Aaron Marcus, as I mentioned. And one of the main takeaways from it is this idea of cultural dimensions. Just to give you guys a little bit of background, he went around the world interviewing IBM employees. And he interviewed 100-plus employees. And he developed initially 4 cultural dimensions that he thought helped define and differentiate one culture from another. Power distance, individualism versus collectivism, masculinity versus femininity, and uncertainty avoidance. Now, later on, he actually was convinced to add a 5th aspect, and that was a long versus short-term time orientation. So, power distance. Power distance speaks to the tolerance that individuals have for the differences between those who have the most power and those who have the least. And some cultures are very comfortable with there being people that are completely powerless and some that are being absolutely powerful, and other cultures have less of a tolerance for that distance. Individualism versus collectivism really comes into play when you think about America or the U.S. versus, say, Japan. In our culture, individualism is rewarded and looked upon as a positive, good thing. If one person can do it, we have that star, or that element. But that's something that we, in fact, take pride in or recognize as being of value. Whereas in other cultures, it needs to be more about the group. The individual is unimportant. It's about the collective. How are we doing it? So that speaks to that aspect. My understanding of the way that masculinity versus femininity refers to is not so much is it a masculine culture, is it a feminine culture, but rather how close or how distinct are gender roles. So in some cultures, there is much more differentiation between what is expected of a male versus what is expected of a female. In other cultures, it's closer together. So we'll see some of the ways in which Japan differs from the U.S. in this regard. So if they expect more distinct roles and behaviors from the two different genders, then it's considered to be a more masculine culture. And if they're closer together in terms of behavior and expectations, then it's considered more feminine on this scale that Hosted came up with. Uncertainty avoidance has to do with individuals' tolerance for the unknown. How comfortable am I with things that are not obvious and well formed and well laid out, and the risk associated with that. And then finally, the long versus short time orientation has primarily to do with the cycle that people feel is comfortable for overall, say, change or expectations. So, for instance, in Japan, we'll look at how a long-term relationship makes much more sense to them. They're not worried about the immediate gratification that, say, in the U.S., we want something to happen today. It's got to happen now. But rather, we expect things to take longer, and things that take longer actually have more value. In fact, if you look up any of this research, and I've got the Aaron Marcus paper where he cites through and goes through his overview on this, there's some specifics around Asian countries and how the various philosophies that, in fact, over thousands of years they accumulated actually contribute to this long-term, long time period orientation. So what I did was I took the numbers that Hosted has from his study, and I just mapped a couple of different countries on a Kvyat diagram. This is a great way of seeing that individualism is prized in the U.S., and there really is not a great deal of distinction between, say, masculinity versus femininity, and that maybe a lower tolerance for power distance and whatnot than, say, in India, where maybe there was a history of social systems that said, hey, there needs to be a distance in power. Some of the key things that pop out for Japan is an absolute intolerance for uncertainty. Everything must be concrete, everything must be distinct and exact. We really did run across this when we were doing research. We found that they wanted to know exactly what it is you mean and make it very explicit on the screen. Don't talk around it. HR speak coming in, we're not happy with it. It needs to be exactly what the case is. And there are very distinct roles in that society. Maybe it's changed a little bit since this research is done, but they tend to think very distinctly around what is male, what is female. In fact, Jason was just telling me an anecdote about how he was in the presence of an older, more seasoned woman and a younger male, and they both went to respond to an answer to a question, and the woman immediately became quiet and let the 18-year-old speak, which probably would not be tolerated in our society. It's not our expectation. I threw these in here because I wanted to note that all the things that roll up into being a user interface and being a user experience, whether it be metaphor, mental models, navigation, interaction, and appearance, and all the things that go in and build what those are, these are elements that need to be considered when you're going to be localizing, because every single one of these aspects may be different from your preconceived notions or your expectations about what you would do and what are going to appear in the interface that's appropriate to the locale that you're localizing for. So as you go through design, these are things you would ask yourself. I'll give you an example. On the web, we use the metaphor of home or home page to mean kind of a top-level page, etc. So one thing you would ask yourself is, well, does that translate? Does that mean anything to go home or a home page? Now, it turns out that some of these things, especially in cultures like Japan, where they are willing to take in languages and other words and just incorporate them and use them just as is to mean the thing that they know it means without worrying about translating it, So as you go through and dive through and look around other Japanese sites, whether it be Amazon Japan or Microsoft Japan or major sites, it is just home of paging. And it means nothing to them in their language, but they know it means the top level page. So while the metaphor is completely broken down, it does not work at all, the language itself works because it's become a de facto standard. So I'm going to give you just a brief project overview and talk about the approach that we took to the research. We did this project starting in the fall and in through the winter of last year. It was an internet human resources site. It was called Career Quest. And we had created the site 2 years prior to doing this project for kind of an internal cultural organizational shift within the large pharmaceutical that we're working for. And it was deemed very successful. And when they acquired a Japanese subsidiary, where they became part of the global company, the Human Resources Department wanted to extend this same program, this information delivery, to the Japanese subsidiary. Initially, the client contact, who was in fact an American working in Tokyo, so he's part of the overall global organization, wanted us to just translate it. And we explained, well, that's not going to be the best if what you want is adoption and people to accept it and people to use it. So they took our recommendation of doing localization rather than simply a straight translation in order to encourage that adoption. So for the research approach, we really got several weeks to prep. And for myself, I was bootstrapping myself on localization, diving into number of the research elements that I have referenced on the sheet I handed out. Diving in a little bit to the culture in which we were going to be going and trying to communicate with. And the website content. Now, in part, this was just getting up to speed on this 2-year-old website that I didn't have a direct hand in creating in the first place. So what does it do? What's going on? But it also meant diving into some of the content that we were being given from the Japanese subsidiary. So my comrade, who's not able to make it, because he reads and speaks Japanese, actually was able to start diving into the already localized content. And this is an important point because if there are specific decisions that have been made at the corporate level around this is the way we're going to translate this is the way we're going to present that, following through with them, that is making sure that what they get in print and what they hear from their manager, what they hear from HR, and what they see on the site need to all be aligned. And by diving into the web content, we were really able to do that. The other thing that we did within this initial approach is develop a straight translation prototype of the site. So because this is a dynamically built, database-driven website, what we ended up having to do is run a spider against the site, get it running locally, fix up what the spider kind of messed up, send it off to translations.com, who are willing and able to take whatever format you give them. If it's a Word doc, if it's a website, whatever it is, they will give it back to you translated in whatever format you give to them. So because we gave them a standalone website in English, they handed back to us in just a couple of days a standalone website in Japanese, right? So in under a week, we got back the site translated directly into Japanese. While this is not the right thing to do to just launch, it's a great way to set up a platform for doing usability testing, for doing research with a straight translation. So it was relatively straightforward and didn't take a whole lot of time or money to do. And then finally, we were obviously doing the standard things that we do when you do user research, usability testing, putting together the test script, developing recruiting, working with the in-country client on who we're going to recruit and how we're going to go about recruiting, setting up recruiting letters and whatnot, making sure you get a good distribution of tenure and role and that kind of thing. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. And then developing the actual script, be it the questions or labeling activities or the usability tasks that we had in mind. Team composition. I want to talk about this a little bit because anyone who's interactive recognizes that it is a team sport and that no one can do this by themselves. And initially, it had been my intent prior to my organization, Refinery, finding out that Mike Scott, who is a content strategist for us, spoke and read Japanese. It was originally my intent to have two user experience architects and work with an interpreter and work with the translation house to translate the elements that we were going to use. And we ended up having a team composition where we had an account strategist who was working primarily with the client as relationship manager, the content strategist, who was really key to the sessions and the content, a creative director that went along with this as a research team, myself as a user experience architect, facilitating the session and organizing the way that things work, and a project manager who really managed logistics for the whole team from back in the States, which in fact is Rich right there. And then the interpreter. Now, the interpreter really acts as an extension of the team, and we'll talk a little bit about ways in which you can foster that. But a lot of the quality of how you work is going to depend on the quality of the interpreter that you get and your relationship with them. They are a key portion of the team when you're doing this type of work. Sure.
I don't know if you'll talk about that later, but how much of this type of work does the interpreter understand, like especially when you're doing user research?
We'll talk about it a little bit, but it's a good point. So my own cultural research, what did I do? Well, I turned to books, I turned to online resources, I turned to friends who had lived there for 4 years, etc. I spent a couple of days reading all of Mark Zimmer's How to Do Business with the Japanese, and while it was a little bit dated, there's a whole lot that I was able to absorb around what cultural norms to expect. So one of the aspects that, and just a little bit of research results, is the fact that there is a specific formality around business cards in Japan. The Meishi ritual is important, and the way in which your business card is created is important. So one of the things that the team did was went out and got Japanese-style business cards that have English on the one side, but Japanese on the other. And there's a specific way that you're intended to exchange them, and a specific kind of formality around the way in which you exchange a business card. Idea that coming up and having a hearty handshake that an American would expect would in fact be offensive to someone in Japan, and that they don't expect a real firm handshake. In fact, they might feel it odd if you, as a Westerner, didn't try to shake their hand, but they don't expect the American style, I want to sell you a car kind of handshake either. I was told, and it turned out that it's actually pretty true, that just wear a dark charcoal gray suit. This is going to be what's the most appropriate. And you did see, I did see a lot of that there. But it also turned out, as I mentioned, that almost anything goes now in business in terms of dress, it seems. The other aspect that we really kind of discovered once we were in the sessions is that body language and hand gesture is important. So if you're a gregarious American and whatnot, that doesn't really fly with the individual who's speaking there. So I found myself trying to be small when I was talking with them and trying not to be my natural self, playing a role that didn't offend the person I was talking to. The other aspect that I wanted to mention is that while there are certainly cultural norms around locale, geography, and country and language, there are also specifics around individual corporations. And just like every company that we work for has its own kind of personality and own culture that's accepted there, when you're looking at doing research for an internal application, there's also specific culture associated with the company that you're looking for, that you're working for. So it's important to delve into that a little bit, because you might find that, for instance, if it is the Japanese subsidiary of a global American company, there might be a whole lot of differences between how they work and another wholly, Japanese company. And it turned out that there were a number of things about this company that were kind of anti-Japanese or counter to Japanese, norms, because they really thought of themselves as a global company. So we saw a number of things like a number of women in high-level executive positions that might be atypical of a normal Japanese company, but for this global pharmaceutical was expected. So I wanted to share this in part because it's humorous, but also because there are so many resources for developing an understanding of what to expect and how to behave. So this, in fact, actually demonstrates the Meishi routine that we're supposed to go through.
私の名刺です。どうぞ。
This is from howtobow.com, which is on that reference sheet.
私は札幌の大阪です。私の名刺です。どうぞ。 担当者の方ですね。はじめまして。どうぞよろしく。
So, like I said before, I didn't develop that animation. So, the couple of key things to note, you hand it with two hands, right? Both hands on it. You don't look them directly in the face, but you're like that. When you receive a card, you don't just go, ah, thanks, etc. You, in fact, pay it some respect. You say, oh, I see you, this. And, in fact, you're expected to, in fact, call out the role. That is their title. Oh, I see you're the project manager of this. You know, so it's something that the respect that you pay the business card that you're handed is the respect that you're paying the individual. So you also don't stuff it in your pocket. So one of the things that I did was I got myself a business card holder, and in fact you have to shop around because their standard for cards is larger than ours. So if you take your regular business card holder, it won't fit. But I paid it the respect of sitting in front of me and giving it a place of honor and prominence in my business card holder as I was sitting there with them. So okay, you know, you're there and you're important to me. While I was thinking about this, I wanted to talk a little about some of the tools we use to leverage it, in getting him up to speed on this project. So one is a Firefox plugin called Rikei-chan, and it was really invaluable to me because I don't read and speak Japanese. So the way that it works, you actually just add it to Firefox, but when you come into a Japanese interface, as you mouse over individual text, okay, it gives you an overlay that starts to translate what those words mean for you right there in the overlay. And the interesting thing is, because combinations of picture symbols or word symbols, ideograms, mean different things, it starts to tell you, when you're mousing over this, what this means by itself. And then when you move a little bit over, it says, oh, okay, well that together means this other thing. And then you mouse over a little bit, okay, these all together, this means something different. So then, in the end, you get to there and it shows you, well, you know what? If there is this one more character on the left, it would mean this other thing. Right? So they show you if it's missing something, well, if it had this to it, it would mean this, and this complete thing means this, but in this little root right here, it means that. So it was really helpful for kind of moving around through assets, looking at the company website and other things that they have and going, what does this say? I don't know. What is this key word? For labeling and whatnot and navigation, it was really helpful to know, oh, I see that phrase is this. So that was invaluable. The other thing, and there are many of these types of translation tools that are out there, but in using Google Translate, one of the benefits of doing so is, this happens to be the Microsoft.co.jp site, but when you put it into Google Translate and you go through and navigate, it does translation, but then it allows you to navigate and continue to navigate the translated site. So you can navigate the entire site, but it keeps running it through its translation. So all the links are in fact rewritten to keep it translated. So that's really handy because you can kind of get around. Now the other thing that this points out is how absolutely abysmal machine translation really is. So if you take a look, the male, as in not female, be completed download. Site, S-I-G-H-T, classified by user. The male be completed information to the one which is utilized with the individual. Okay, so it doesn't do a great job, but what it does allow you to do is to get around, right? So you can navigate through a space and you absolutely do not speak, but get the gist of what they're talking about, even if it is in fact humorously bad. It's going to be decades before machine translation really is worth, even thinking about having it do anything. Humans are so much better at it. So this is the point where I hand it off to my Japanese reading and speaking partner. But in lieu of that, I will bluff my way through several of these slides. So there are 3 main writing systems, and you can really think of it as 4. But there is kanji, which in fact is lifted wholly from the Chinese country and writing in about I think the 5th century common time or AD. There is hiragana, which is syllabary, meaning it's the sound symbols of how to say something. that was developed a century later, and it's used to to spell the words in a way that you can sound them out. Katakana, which today is largely used to spell out the sound of words that are words in other languages, but in order to help people pronounce them, here are the sound symbols to pronounce this foreign word. So those three. And then finally, Romanji, which is simply Roman characters, right, our regular character set, but perhaps pronounced as if it was written in katakana. Okay, so the characters that you see that are very busy like this and are identical to Chinese are kanji. These more angular symbols are katakana. Those are used for writing the foreign. And then there's hiragana, which I did not see a lot of in terms of the web and whatnot. You see a lot of romanji, you see a lot of katakana and kanji. Not a lot of hiragana being used. Although one of the first and most famous novels maintained from Japanese antiquity is actually written completely in hiragana. And I believe it was written by a woman. So another important point around Japanese is that all of those writing systems can be used in the very same sentence. So it goes from one to another, to another, to another, back to one within the span of just a single sentence. So the sentence that says the traditional EUC encoding used to handle Japanese character codes on Unix look like this mixes a whole bunch of different symbol types, from romanji to katakana to kanji. So that's something that, in fact, when you take a look at websites that are in Japanese, it's acceptable. But something that we realized we needed to pay important attention to, and we'll talk about that in the design, of what it is. So the other aspect that I wanted to mention here was the fact that topography is still a design issue in other languages. There are the flow of text, which traditionally was right to left in Japanese, but has shifted in a good bit, especially on the web, to from left to right. So both are acceptable. Much of the manga that you see folks reading on the subway and the people reading magazines and books are still printed and written from right to left. So the cover of the magazine is what we would interpret as the back of the magazine, and in fact it reads right to left when you do that. But it goes every which way. So you might have a magazine, in fact, goes from right to left, but is printed and written from left to right as you move through, or right to left. They just know by the context which way it's going. Also, top to bottom, while it feels older, more like something like, ceremonial banner and whatnot, it's also perfectly acceptable. If it's seen, as long as the text makes sense in the context, it's not considered a problem to go top to bottom. The other point I wanted to make is that serif typefaces, in the same way that ours, the Times, Times New Roman, etc., Palatino, they feel older. Well, the same is true in the Japanese culture. The ones that have serifs, in fact, feel older. The ones that are more Gothic, that have more solid lines, etc., are more modern. Okay, and it's so it's the same kind of feel that type can give us. And one other aspect that's actually particular with Japanese is the fact that because most of the typefaces are treated as monospaced fonts, but the characters can become very busy. In a monospace font, what you get is mixed densities, right? So you can go from very dense to very open as you move from kanji to katakana and whatnot, if it is in fact monospace. So one of the things you have to think about in terms of design is if you're putting together images or graphics, you can control the kerning in order to in fact make it look more pleasing. You can't really do this too easily in HTML-based stuff, but for the graphical treatments, you can. These were taken from an article that's also referenced on the reference sheet. I don't have it individually sourced here. But you can see that it takes non-monospacing in order to have decent kerning. I also want to mention that the typeface itself has a lot to do with how things feel. So look and feel of a typeface. So you can have something that is kind of informal and taking to where things are more formal, to things that maybe are bold. One of the aspects around this is you can't get too bold, or you won't be able to see all of the small strokes that go into the particular character. Also, the bolder it gets, the more it feels like maybe an advertisement. So you might see, I might see it, bold one, couple of words or a phrase, but it's going to say this is kind of an ad. So the density really affects the stylistic choices that you make around what typeface to use and what you're doing. So this anecdote is taken from an old story around Americans talking to a Navajo back when he was trying to understand the Navajo language. And as he was trying to put together the words and form sentences, he asked this Navajo, okay, well, can I say? I can say this. And he goes, oh yes, you can say that. Can I say this? Oh, yeah, you can say that. Well, can I say this? Oh yeah, you can say that. And he goes, okay, so all of those are grammatically correct. He said, oh no, they're all very wrong. He said, but you said I could say them. He said, well, you can say them. You're not Navajo. So part of what it indicates is that getting inside, finding a way into understanding a language and a culture and whatnot, you might have to come at it at a couple of different angles. So you can say that, but it might not be what they would say. And therefore, it's the wrong thing for you to say when you're in fact putting together an interface. So thinking about that a little bit, there was another anecdote here that Mike was going to tell about Humpty Dumpty in Alice in Wonderland. But having not done anything other than seen the movie and not actually read the full book, I'm not going to try and tell that anecdote. But the gist of it is, the point is that you have to decide what individual words are going to mean. You have your own definition, right? So who's going to be the master controller of what does this word mean versus what that means, right? And people tend to try and define those things for themselves, but when you're localizing, you cannot. You have to determine what does that word mean to this body, or this group, this audience, this individual, in this particular culture, in this particular organization, and whatnot. And going into the project, we had a number of words where we had some questions about, were we going to use them as Romanji? Were we going to spell them out as katakana, so the way they sound, to try and do them? Were we going to try and find a native word that was going to be appropriate to translate into kanji? And so these words really came up in a lot of the content, so we had to understand what were we going to do about some of these key words as they fit into the program we were trying to communicate. Okay, the sessions ran about an hour and a half. We had 30-minute breaks planned in between. We were doing about 4 a day. We had 2 different key locations. One was in Tokyo, and we traveled out to a suburb known as Tsukuba. There were 2 different kind of audiences. The ones in Tokyo were more kind of business-based or focused. The scientists that were doing the hard, biological research, chemical research, were in the suburb. One of the things that I'd learned about in my cultural kind of learning about what to do with when working with teams there is how to build a sense of togetherness, and how to say we're all in this together. You're already part of a team. You're not just someone that I'm coming to interview. And that was to try and set up assignments prior to arriving. So we distributed a letter that said, please do these couple of things. Can you please bring a picture that you think symbolizes this, and bring us some websites that you think you like or are very very useful to you, or you think they're easy to use or difficult to use, and let's talk about it, etc. And that's in order to get people already their head in the game that you are part of this larger team. You're not just someone that's a participant. In using an interpreter, there's a couple of guidelines, and you'd mentioned some questions around trying to work with an interpreter. We were told by our client, well, not everybody wants an interpreter. Some of them, I think they don't need it. Don't listen to it. You need an interpreter for every single session. And we insisted upon it, and it was a really good thing, because someone had said, oh, no, my English is good. Their English is great for reading and writing. For verbal communication, you are going to want to have an interpreter for every single session. It's best to have an advanced meeting with your interpreter before you've done any of the research sessions. And this goes a little bit to your question. We sat down, went through the script, talked about what we were trying to get at. This is what we were trying to understand. Here are some particular phrases that we're going to ask. How are you going to translate that? And what does that mean literally? How are you working with this particular script, and what are you going to do? So we had an agreement. We spent a good hour and a half of that 2 hours we'd set aside prior to ever getting in front of a participant to work with an interpreter. So having that time really strengthened our understanding of oh yes, this is what the project is about, this is what we're trying to get at, this is why we're asking this question this way. Don't tell them this, don't tell them that, don't tell them anything. We want to let them tell us what it is that they want. It's also really best, if you can, to have the same interpreter for every session. Having to go up to speed and not have kind of the collective knowledge and understanding of the past sessions that have gone on with the new interpreter can be problematic. And we ended up working with 3 over all the sessions, but it was essentially 1 per location. So we really did kind of work with a consistent interpreter. Don't run on for 4 minutes and then turn to the interpreter and say, okay, remember all that, say it. It's best to speak a couple of sentences at a time. You're expected not to address the interpreter, who in fact then addresses the person that you're interviewing, but in fact you address directly the person that you are interviewing, even if they don't necessarily understand everything you're saying. And then the interpreter translates for you, interprets for you. There's a big distinction between translate and interpret. In fact, some of the reading that I did said that a lot of times in these situations, individuals you're speaking with will treat the interpreter as a non-entity. Like they're not even here, they're furniture, they're automated. All they do is put the words in and pull the words out, and they don't really exist. Now, I didn't find that to be true in the culture that I was in, within the company, etc., but I imagine that it is probably true in some business situations where they're just meant to be quiet and be a conduit for translating the language, interpreting the language. And then pay special attention to the physical arrangement that you choose when you're doing your sessions, and we'll take a look at what we decided to do. For our sessions, we were having the interpreter and Mike, our content strategist who understands Japanese, listen for keywords and phrases and ways that they might refer to some of the concepts that we were trying to communicate. Because if they didn't match what maybe the organization had previously used, or what maybe some of our preconceived notions around how we were going to translate them was going to work, we wanted to make note of that. And we did find numerous examples where we had to make some judgment calls around which direction should we go. The way that corporate wants to, in fact, jam down this American idea, or do we, in fact, choose the word that the individuals that were participating really, this is the thing that would actually say that to me better. We had some compromises in that way. And then, finally, I know a number of you probably use Moray for doing usability testing and whatnot. We were able to use Moray as well, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the findings concerning that. Okay, we're good. I mentioned the Meiji exchange. This really started off most of the sessions. Some people, because they felt that we were coming from inside their company, right? We were internal already. They didn't think, well, I'm meeting with someone outside the company, so they didn't bother bringing, their business card. But I still ended up with a stack of roughly, half of the 21 people we interviewed, maybe a little bit more, of a business card exchange with each of them, and going through that ritual. We went through an introduction describing particularly, maybe more so than what you would normally do in a user research example setting, the relationship between the two companies. That is, we are not outsiders, you're communicating. We've worked with your parent company for over 5 years. This is very important because, I think we talked about before, their long-term inclination versus the short-term inclination, right? So it's more about long-term relationships. It doesn't matter what happens today or right now. Don't expect results right away. In fact, it's about a long-term relationship. So we tried to emphasize the fact that we'd in fact really been working with their company for many, many years, and we're just now getting to meet them. We talked about the cultural change that was going on within the organization, both the larger organization that we'd already helped develop 2 years prior, but then the specific cultural changes that were going on within their company as part of being acquired, as part of the change that we were helping roll out and communicate about with the website. We did conduct a labeling exercise, and there's a point I'll make later, but be prepared to alter what you're doing or the materials you're working with as you go through sessions. Well, I understand that we want to be consistent as we do user research, and from session to session you want to try and remain consistent. If you find that certain things are not working in the first session or two, be flexible. Change it up. You might in fact find you found out enough about that. Now you can spend the next 10 sessions learning a little something more, getting more in depth. Or you might find that this particular thing's not working. You need to adjust it or redesign it so that in fact it starts actually doing work for you. We had a whole area of discovery around design aesthetics. Some of the things we were asked to do, they were meant to bring photos in, and a lot of people did bring magazines and photos to speak to something. Reference websites that they pointed us to. We also did a series of color explorations and stock photography explorations. And this is a point where, when you're doing localization, it's a level of detail that maybe some might ignore, but while my untrained eyes honestly cannot tell the difference between the individual genetic makeup and the features and whatnot from individual areas. The individuals that we are working with could absolutely spot, okay, well, that person's not Japanese. Okay, well, that's not the way it works in the lab. No, that's an unsafe business practice. Oh, that's a thing. So all of these things that stock photographers who hire beautiful models to come in and pose to be their scientist and their geeker and this or that are largely wrong. And if you're going to try and communicate the right things internally with people with those types of sensitivities, you don't want to just come out with the stock photography that's wrong. You need to be very careful about those choices. So we were, in fact, testing some of those choices and options that we had. Even though there are well-known, say, differences in color communication across cultures, we also just wanted to understand this particular area, this particular audience, or the specifics that we should take into account. We performed a usability test with key tasks. And largely here, we just want to understand, did we inherit some design problems or problems that wouldn't have been a problem in the culture it was designed for, but in the culture we were localizing for did represent an issue. And finally, as I mentioned, we were really listening for the use of key phrases that would allow us to localize the concepts. So took a little bit of trial and error to get Murray to run on just an ad hoc network of 2 laptops that are just plugged into a hub. And you've got nothing that's assigning them a name, there's not names assigned, etc. How do you, in fact, get them to hook up? Well, it turns out you can do it, but you have to manually assign IPs for each of the laptops that are involved, and then point the Murray software to that specific IP. But if you do that, you can actually get it running over a small network, even though you don't have things working the way you normally would. So another aspect that I want to just mention is that if you're going to need to be doing something on the ground while you're there, you need to take into account that standards are completely different. Right? So if we prepared all of our materials and whatnot for 8.5 by 11, when we got there, we would have had huge, silly margins on the things we printed out because they don't use 8.5 by 11 paper. So if you're not carrying a big stack of paper with you on the plane, you're going to need to print out there. What size do you need to print out? Well, check and see what the standards are in the local country that you're going to. And so we already had thought of that, and all of our materials were designed so we could print them out right there when we got there. And when we changed throughout the course, we could in fact reprint them all and not have any problem with that. I wanted to point out the arrangement that we used with the 2 laptops running the Murray recorder and the notes taking there, and the configuration of the way we were at the table. What we found really was going to work best. Myself sitting here as a moderator, being able to speak to the participant who's being recorded by Murray at the laptop and using the interface, with the interpreter sitting directly across from them. And what this allowed them to do is they could comfortably look at myself when I'm addressing them, or the interpreter if they needed to, without showing their head to the back of the camera. So it was really very convenient to organize in this fashion, with me at the end of the table, them sitting right next to me, and we got good video of everyone, and everyone was comfortable in their talking arrangement that we had intended. This was the redesigned labeling exercise, or part of it. And initially, the way we were trying to collect it, they didn't grasp the concept. It was too confusing in the way that I had laid it out and designed it. But based on input from the interpreter on the first day and the types of questions we were being asked by the individuals, I went back to the hotel and relayed this out. And from the next point on, from using this, everyone instantly understood the exercise, knew exactly what was expected of them, and went, oh, okay. They went right down to it, and it took much less time and took very little explanation. So that's the kind of thing that you might find that the way in which you thought it might work, in fact, does not, and that there might be a better way of doing their collecting. So I mentioned that we started with a site prototype that was just a straight site translation. This is, and I've redacted all of these screens, but this is the actual site as it was originally launched 2 years prior in the US. And then this is the straight translated site that we got back in under a week from translations.com. This is what we use to conduct a usability test. This is all but one of our participants. I don't have the video from sessions here for you, but they were a great bunch and really showed a cross spectrum of the organization. One of the things that I will say is that there were certainly more director level and senior people that I really did not care about there. Okay? This site was not a site for that audience, and normally what we try to do is in fact just recruit only from the people that you're actually targeting. Why was this important to do? Well, when you're coming in and doing something like this in an organization, I think maybe even more so than other cultures in the Japanese culture, part of what you're doing is socializing an idea. You're socializing a concept about, hey, this is something that we're doing. Hey, that's been given buy-in from the highest levels. Hey, we've been told we're going to spend time and money on this. Oh, this does matter. Hey, I'm going to tell the people that I'm working with about this. This thing is coming. So in part, what we are doing by including director-level individuals that really are not targets for the particular site and the communication we're putting together was giving them a sense of, yes, I have been listened to. My viewpoint has been heard. I will get to weigh in on the way this thing goes. And it creates a larger sense of a group that, there's a concept in the Japanese culture called nimawashi, which essentially says all of the decisions will be made prior to the meeting where we talk about the decisions that we're going to make. That is, everything is already arranged ahead of time, and everybody already knows what the answers are. It's just a formality when you finally get together and say, so it's going to be this? Oh, yes, I agree. But, in fact, everybody agreed weeks prior. And as part of what you're doing is you're creating that. Loved our interpreters. I actually don't have the third one who was only there with us for part of the day. But Yoko 1, Yoko 2. So the results. How did things go by this process of a multidisciplinary team and doing localization instead of straight translation? Well, there was a couple of things that we determined. We talked about the different types of language and the different writing samples, and we talked about those key words that we were going to be looking at in here. It was determined that these 4 words we were going to use katakana for. That there had been enough explanation of it internally, but it was looked at as maybe a foreign word that had been adopted, that it made sense to use a katakana pronunciation of an American word in these cases. And it's a little bit tricky because the name of the site, the name of the program internally was Career Quest. This had been determined early on was not going to change. They wanted to continue to call it Career Quest, even though a quest is nothing in Japanese, and a career is, in fact, not generally a word. So part of what we were balancing there in our compromises was having in text career be a katakana word, but in the logo maintaining career as a romanji word. So what about the title of the site? We had different things we played with, whether or not we were going to try and interpret it. We're going to try and say, well, what is a quest? Well, here are all these words that mean like a venture that you go on and whatnot, and you're going to do. Well, okay, no, you're not going to do that. Eventually the business said, no, we're just going to keep it career quest. So little compromise, it's career and katakana throughout text, but the logo and the name of the site itself is in fact still Career Quest as a global organizational standard. Certain terms that we decided needed to be kanji, and at times a combination of kanji and katakana. Again, normal for the culture. We've seen how you can have multiple writing styles together. So the promotion process, in fact, involved a combination of hyphenated kanji word with process as a katakana word. What you'll find is that, I thought, hey, Americans are great at absorbing, other cultures' words and saying, okay, well, it's ballet and it's, this. But in fact, the Japanese do it everywhere. So you see English words pronounced however they want to on brands and whatnot. It's Mr. Fix-It, it's Mr. Auto, it's, everywhere that you could read, but they feel like that's just part of their, they don't mind absorbing it. So that was pretty typical. So each of these things were things that we determined that needed to be a kanji term rather than romanji or katakana. So they were actually translated to a word concept in the native language, right? So those 2 different decisions. There were some terms that were problematic. Resources or tools and resources, which you might see in a utility navigation on the site or whatnot. Job families, which was problematic. The problem is, when you're working with HR speak, it already doesn't make sense to the Americans that you're looking at, right? So tools and resources, what is that crap? It's miscellaneous, right? It says nothing, right? A job family. This is something that somebody made up somewhere and said, okay, we've got this group and it's going to mean this and whatnot. But it already doesn't work in English. So it becomes even harder now to try and translate that into the native word. And then finally, there are some culture issues that you might deal with, whether or not we're an external group, whether or not we're internal. The decisions that are being made, is that in fact part of the WA, or the peace and tranquility, the Nemawashi that goes on. An acceptance of top-down approval. That is, there's a kind of more buy-in to the, oh well, it's okay to have somebody that's more powerful and higher up. If they determine that that's what it is, then I'll just lockstep behind it, and that's fine. That's been the decision, and I'll accept that without question. I mentioned before that prior approval, that everything's already decided before the meeting where you sit down and say, what did we decide? That Nemawashi really needed to take effect and occur in key leaders before we can in fact say, okay, well, this is a decision that's been made. We had to know that that was already the decision that had been made before we said, this is the decision. Being very low confrontational. This is something that people, usability practitioners, user research practitioners, we have a hard time anyway, right? Getting people to be critical of this. They don't want to hurt your feelings. Oh, no, it's fine if you just, I don't like that. Well, this is a culture where they really didn't want to, insult something. So getting them to speak negatively about what doesn't work, it's more challenging, right? They're not willing to say, this doesn't work. So you had to kind of, get what small bits you could out of, if it wasn't absolutely perfect, you knew there was something very wrong with it. But they did have a lower level of skepticism around, well, if this is what the company's doing, then okay, then I will go ahead and do that. So in the end, what site design did we end up with? This was the homepage. We maintained CareerQuest as a brand, but you can see we incorporated in much more in terms of groups of individuals, of the way in which they're interacting, fully screened and reviewed by the team even after we came back, sending out stock photography to the team that participated and saying, what do you think of this picture? What do you think of that picture? And in fact, a couple of iterations of reviews, it says, no, not that one. No, not that. Oh yeah, this one's okay. Not so bad, right? Not so bad as, we can use it. Subpages that follow more or less the site design, interaction design that we had going on within the site, but with a couple of key changes. So one of those key changes was the fact that we had to lay out the type in such a way that it could expand and contract and flow differently than it did in English. So because we had seen individuals within the just straight translated prototype squinting and trying to read, because what might be okay at 10-point English was difficult to read in a complex kanji character, we were able to add two key things. One was a layout that allowed the center content column to be liquid or stretchy, but with a maximum. So while I put my programmer through hell, what it did allow us to do is say that, hey, it doesn't go any smaller than this. It's a good reading line. But it doesn't go any wider than this. So we won't max out a reading line length that's comfortable to, in fact, track through. So to help readability. And at that point, when you resize, it centers itself, but the inside, resizes. The other aspect was being able to give the individual control over the size of the type. Oftentimes I've worked with designers where they want to control the exact pixel and have it be displayed exactly the same time and not give up that control to the individual user. Because I was able to have the creative director in the sessions watching and hearing individual comments and whatnot, we were able to get behind having user control of the type size. So you can see that if you have resizing to where it in fact can expand out to a particular maximum, but you can also have it resize and just have it reflow in place. So that if there were issues with the size of the type, they could simply make it bigger in the browser and be able to have it more legible for them without breaking the flow of the design. Yes?
Things like what's the minimum and maximum size of that sentence, like things like that, who do you rely on for the information?
Well, we actually just collaborated as a team. We took into aspects like, because this was an intranet site, what are the resolution standards within the organization for what they have? What size screens to resolution are they using? What did we know we needed to have in terms of all the content on the homepage? So what's kind of our minimum? We don't want things to look cramped, but we have to include this. Here's a base size. How does it expand from there? So we really did a little bit of trial and error to determine like what is too wide, too long, and we took into account the way in which text could resize. So all those things were aspects that we utilized to make the determination of what metrics to use. Logistics. I want to talk about this because it was my first time overseas. It's a lot to put together when you're doing a research program anyway, let alone trying to do it in a cross-continental team where some people in the U.S., some people over there. So there are a lot of things to take care of beforehand. So one is that I felt like, when you're traveling in the cities, having travel maps, having them with me at all time made me feel more comfortable. Recognizing that you're going to need to exchange currency, and maybe you're going to be traveling with a couple $1,000s that you needed to immediately when you got off the plane exchange. Recognizing that there are many places where they're just not going to take cash. Some cultures are in fact cash-oriented. They're not going to take a credit card. So you need to make sure you have the right balance of, do I have the right card? Will the cards work there? If I can't use a card, do I have enough cash? Have I exchanged enough? Power supplies, because around the world there are different power standards and requirements. And if you've never traveled and tried to plug a Dell in someplace else, you don't realize, oh shoot, I don't have that kind of plug. You need to make sure to have that logistics worked out. For safety purposes, making sure that you know where you're going to be working, where the American Embassy is, or for research purposes, where the American Chamber of Commerce location is. Medical facilities and what you need to be able to tell them. And they have different ratings around their proficiency in English, so if you're going to need to talk to them, is it going to be possible there? Am I covered there? And then, language and phrase assistance as you might need. So I'm going to make a plug for my favorite platform on handheld, and that is the Palm. I can't tell you, even if I had to go without native speaking Mike Scott, I would have been able to get around because I was able to pull down subway maps, city maps right into my Palm. I was able to pull down travel guides that told me about restaurants to eat at, where I should eat, areas. This is good shopping in Tokyo. This is that, all right there with me. And even a language program that allowed me to key phrases that I needed to be able to say, to have it say it to me first, and then me to say, Nihongo wa hanasemasen. I do not speak Japanese. And Kredito kado wa tsukaimasu ka? Do you take credit cards? So things that if I didn't know them, I could in fact figure out what I needed to do to ask for a taxi back to this hotel in a language that I could communicate with the individual. The program that I used, and it's in fact in the reference sheet, was called Japan to Go. They offer it in many different languages, many different cultures. I found it was really helpful to have. I could get around a little bit even if I didn't have my native speaking comrade with me. But they offer it in many different languages, so wherever you're traveling, it's available to you, and not just on Palm, on multiple platforms as well. Another interesting aspect, in addition to like the slideshow that you saw shot with my Palm Trio, was that most of the restaurants you go to have little plastic examples of all the dishes that they serve in front of the restaurant. Okay, but if you don't know how to order it or can't read it there, how do you order what you want? Well, pretty quickly I realized, oh, you know what? I'll just take a picture of that one, and then I go in, and then the waitress goes, sorry, no English. I said, oh, thank you, and they're very happy that you facilitated that exchange by just pictorially, right? Because it communicates better. This is the one I want. I want the shrimp with whatever this is. I don't know. But it's very helpful, communicating via pictures. So just a couple of localization tips, because I felt that was the right way to wrap up this discussion. Research really can work using an interpreter. Don't be hesitant about it. You really can do decent, good quality research working through an interpreter. But you really do have to meet first to have an understanding of what the session goals are, what approach you're taking, agree upon the way the key terms are going to be interpreted throughout all of the sessions. If it's possible, having the same interpreter, and really allowing for extra time to compensate. So what normally would have been an hour-long session, we booked an hour and a half. We didn't always need it, but we felt like because of the potential for language confusion and needing to go through these things a couple of times, let's give ourselves a 50% buffer. It ended up we probably only needed a 30% buffer, but still, it was healthy, it was the right thing to do. You will absolutely need supporting team members, whether it's people that you're working with on the ground there, I can help you either get around or get lunch or print things out or whatnot, or whether it's people that are mindful of international time zones and are able to coordinate things for you so that you have things prepared at the right time or you're able to get something from back at home. It certainly is possible, but don't let the logistics overwhelm you. Give yourself some lead time to compensate for jet lag. So for instance, we arrived and we're in country for 2 days prior to starting our session. We weren't arriving and the next day and you get there, because it wouldn't have made sense. We would have been dead tired. We've been working in the evening and sleeping in the day. It wouldn't have worked out. So you have to, in fact, allow your body time to adjust. And thinking about things like that. Fully prep for the timing and the location, because if you've never been there and you're trying to travel in a different language, you might need a little extra time. Having a client extranet set up, once we were back stateside, be able to share things, smoothly in a way that allowed them to get and review items. And like I mentioned before, planning for regional differences, whether it be power or paper size or whatnot. Again, this is just a review, so being prepared to evolve your research or the session materials as you go through. One of the things we found is we reached a point where we really had all the answers we needed around the particular body of design and aesthetic work. We just changed it up. We just started asking different questions and got different materials in and dove a little deeper into some certain areas. So we've got more than what we initially thought we would be able to out of the sessions. So one final note is that when you're working with a translation partner, you really do need to be careful. Best practice, and if you go through and do all that research in the localization sheet I handed out, you'll find that one of the things people talk about is developing a translation dictionary that gives you a set of agreements on every time you see this phrase, it will be translated in this way, and always do it that way with the translation firm. They'll follow it some of the time. They won't follow it all of the time, so you're really going to have to go through and do reviews. So one of the things that we did, we actually engaged the client and some of the core team there to do part of that review. Right? So as things got translated, sending them out to them and saying, okay, is this right? At the same time, doing a little bit of auditing ourselves to say, have they done what we asked them to do? And it turns out they probably won't always do what you want them to do, even though you've created the translation dictionary. Are there any questions? Yes, Kevin.
How did it affect the information architecture? Did you find that you had to structure stuff differently, not just the taxonomies of it, but the actual content and arrangement of the group?
So it's a good question, and certainly that was one of the things we were looking at. We did not fundamentally change the key categories of the way that the program is broken out, because in essence, it was a global program that there were certain categories. However, one of the things we were able to do was argue for complete deletion of useless material. Right? Here's a bunch of HR speak that you just do not need, and it's not going to translate anyway, so why spend the time or money? Let's just delete that. And maybe the inclusion of additional content within a particular category. They said, you know what, we really need to supplement this. There's some curiosity or ambiguity around this topic or this area. You need to include that. And then more so, the labeling. If you're going to try and communicate this concept, what are you going to use in here? And that was where we got into that language of, is it a complete native kanji word? Is it katakana saying the thing? Is it just romanji because it's been sorted out? So those type of things came up in the IAA. Yes.
Can I just jump on that, because I was interested in how the team actually came up with a decision of which would be the right language and character set to use for those different labels. How did that
It was a combination of working with our really, really good interpreters who had said, you know what, we had the benefit of using interpreters who had worked for the company in the past as they went through some of these materials. So they were familiar with some of the concepts and said, well, material I reviewed said this, oh, they're already using that, it's been seen, it's been announced, etc. So there's a little bit of that. Working with kind of the company stakeholders and saying, oh, no, we want to stick with this one, even though they said this, we're going to need to make this judgment call. But also, when we did our labeling exercise, when we did that, we put together all of the labeling results of what individuals said, and already, because everyone in the core team had been in on the sessions, so, had a hunch around this is what's going to work, this is what's not going to work, and run it by the client to get permission, essentially, to be as locally and natively, adjusted as we were permitted to. So it was that type of compromise.
Did you find that the results in general were pretty consistent across the participants, or were there wide variations? And what
there
kinds
was definitely
trends did you see in the differences in participants?
There was definitely a decent amount of variation. The types of trends that you would see would be things like those who had already become familiar with specific content because they'd exposed themselves to it, so they already thought, oh yeah, it's okay to be this katakana or this romanji word. Whereas others, maybe proportionate to the higher up that they went, who were less familiar with content around their career and whatnot, who, said, no, too much katakana. So it was one of the things that we got from individuals in the prototype. Oh, too much katakana, it doesn't feel native, it feels foreign. Have less of that. So those types of things. Yes?
What kind of role did color play in your design?
It played a key role. It turns out that I won't call it stereotypical, but the reported in the literature color trends and norms around the culture ended up proving out true. As a culture, it turned out that blues and greens were found to be very comforting and familiar and strong, and it did the type of communication that we wanted. So we ended up with those as some of the key colors in the design. As you went around, you saw different brands that in fact used essentially those same colors, are already pervasive. So we did that. It also had to do with not just blindly following with the colors that had been created for the initial brand with oranges and whatnot that didn't really speak or resonate with that audience. In part, our take is that their historical and ancient kind of relationship with nature and with being kind of an ocean-oriented island and the blues and then a lot of trees and the green and stuff, that there was in fact in the color studies a predominant preference for blues and greens. So we incorporated blues and greens into the site so to be thought of as being aesthetically pleasing. So in the end, one of the greatest compliments that we got coming from the individuals when we rolled it out and had a look at it was, my gosh, it looks so Japanese. That was the comment. And so once you hear that when you've done localization, between the typography, the aesthetics, the color palette, the language that's being used, and the stock photography that's being utilized, that you've gotten those things lined up to where it feels like a locally produced product. Yes.
Did you uncover any user goals that weren't supported by the English side? And
absolutely, absolutely, and we were not permitted to address them. So there were some very specific questions, and it had to do with that ambiguity to concrete, thing that I want this, I want, this is what we want in the content, it needs to be this way, and reported it to the client, said this is really what your audience wants to see. And they said, no, that's not the corporate way, and we will in fact be doing it the corporate way. You're only going to go to this level. This is how we're going to do it. Thank you very much. So like we've all dealt with clients who just don't take up what my users want this for an answer. There were times where we didn't have that. In order to compensate, and as a part of that whole group in Milwaukee thing, the client ended up going out and doing a rollout tour where they had 20 people at a time come in and they hand walked them through how to use the site, what it's there, what its purpose was, and what it wasn't going to do. So it's not as if the interface was a failure, but rather that was what the expectation was around how he was going to socialize the existence of the site and what it would and wouldn't do. But there was no explanation to the individuals who participated around, well, why didn't it do that? Why didn't it do this? We noted that it was desired, and the client noted that they were not prepared to deliver it.
And did you find big cultural differences in those goals that weren't covered? Is it something that just...
You know what? I mean, one of the things, it's funny, one of the things that Mike always says is everything that you hear about Japan is true, and so is the opposite. And one of the things that I found in that the very themes, whether it was the cultural research that I did beforehand or the things we discovered then, they were often elements that were also true for, say, me personally, or what I saw about in my own culture, or own experience, but maybe amplified, maybe more so, right? So no one really likes the ambiguity of not knowing what do I need to do to be promoted or what does my role expect. But the tolerance for the level of ambiguity might be greatly less in a different culture than it might be in other cultures, where it's okay, I'm an individual, I'll work it out for myself. Oh, no, it's a group thing. So it was really more of kind of an amplification of natural human responses to certain types of things that maybe differ from culture to culture. Yes?
How do non-Latin-based language keywords work? There is such a thing.
By keywords, I assume you mean for search purposes and indexing.
No, I just mean interface keyword.
Oh, keyboard. I thought you said keyword. Sorry, I'm thinking SEM, SEO. It's a great point. You can install, as part of your Windows XP, the ability to put in characters in other languages, the way that Japanese works. You start spelling out the sound in hiragana on your keyboard. There's like each sound, you get a sound that's close on your QWERTY keyboard, and then it gives you options. You can mean this one or this one or this one, and you just kind of tab through them and kind of quickly can put that. And then once you spell out the hiragana, it then rewrites it as the kanji, what you said. So it makes a translation between the two. Now, it's interesting you should bring that up because the laptop that we were using for doing the actual prototype and walking through, I didn't have those components installed because, unlike Mike, I wasn't producing content in Japanese, and I didn't want to do that here. Individuals would say, "Oh, can I type Japanese in this?" No, I'm sorry, I don't have my system set up to be able to do that. But they are QWERTY keyboards, they're going, but there's a certain system that allows them to kind of input. And there's a little bit of AI, artificial intelligence, in the system that allows it to kind of guess, oh, okay, I think you mean this one. Oh, no, you mean that one? Okay, and correct it. Interestingly, one of the things that we saw on the subways was people not with keyboards, but a lot of women that had just the 9 key and were rapidly moving their thumb around and just typing INs back and forth in Japanese with 9 keys. Well, 10 keys including the 0, but with decent speed and accuracy. So there's a system that's even more advanced than the T9 system that we use for lookup there for that same kind of I think you mean this, okay, you choose that one and keep going. Because he was putting out, more than 10 words a minute. I mean, if that's all the questions, I actually had, as we found out, I've got a little video that I shot in the hotel room that I posted on YouTube from there because I'd never done it and I wanted to see if I could. When you come back to the hotel, and in fact everywhere you go, music pervades everywhere. It is the worst music ever, everywhere, okay? So, this is coming back to the hotel room every single night. And if you don't notice the melody, this is the perfect feelings. Doesn't matter when you return, the 1970s stereo is turned on and up. Well, actually, it's a little bit low, actually, with music, non-stop. 4 stations of it. That's it. So bring your CDs. Or discover in the local HMV the latest hip English band that we were listening to when we first came in while you're there. Welcome to Japan! Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Okay, first, of course, I'd like to thank John for giving us the time and giving us that great presentation this evening. Also, I'd like to thank GSI who graciously supported the event, sponsored the event for us, and gave us the nice facility. We will be having future events, so please feel free to check out our website, upadelawarevalley.org. And before you leave, please have some more food, get some drinks. Oh, we're also going to be posting video of this event. So just come visit the site. And we're also planning to post some videos of prior events that we've done also. So come check out the website, upadelawarevalley.org.
Are you posting John's slide set?
We will not
I actually am not planning on making the slide set available, but I can make the reference sheet available electronically. If anyone didn't get a business card they want to, just email me and I'll send you that reference, those hyperlinks, instead of you having to type it in.
Thank you very much.